Jennifer is an alumni of Booth University College, having graduated with her Bachelor of Social Work. Jennifer also holds a Bachelor of Arts with a major in conflict resolution and a Master's of Arts in Indigenous Governance. In addition to working at Manitoba Justice for 10 years, Jennifer was employed with the Office of the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth as an advocacy officer and a registered social worker. Jennifer will be joining Booth University College as an assistant professor this coming July 1st, 2022. Jennifer's most recent experience was focused on Indigenous self-determination in governance and justice, as well as directing services and programs in an Indigenous nonprofit organization. Jennifer has a private practice with a focus on organizational capacity and restorative interventions. Her favorite roles include being a mother of her 2 sons and engaging in her community. Well, Jen, it's your turn to take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody who has made time this evening to come together. This is just an opportunity for us to share over story. And, I want it to be relaxed. So if you need your tea, your blanket, whatever you have there, feel free to get comfortable. I know I am. I have a smudge going here, virtual smudge, of course. It's, just to kind of clear the space and clear the intention so we can move forward in a good way. So thank you for that introduction. All right, so O Canada, our home on Native land, healing through story. So today we're going to explore our relationships to the land in what is now called Canada and concepts of collective healing through a process of story. In my opinion, this idea of collective healing is fundamental groundwork for change and reconciliation in Canada. So I'm very passionate about this topic. So if you see me reading, it's truly because I have notes here, because as soon as I look away, I just go with it and I will end up talking about something completely different. So I've got my notes here to try to keep us on focus and stay conscious of time. But I know that about myself because I get really passionate. It's like a river and it just comes flowing. And if I look away, we'll end up going somewhere else. With that said, I'm presenting today from Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional and sacred lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Oji-Cree nations, and is the heart and homeland of the beautiful Red River Métis Nation. I will continue to tell my story of commitment to this land throughout the presentation, and I will share some prompts and ideas so that you can begin connecting with your own personal stories, all part of this process of collective healing and reconciliation for those of us here in Canada. All right, so let's see if I can get my slides up. There we go. There we go. Okay, so if you put your hand up, I may not be able to see you. So just feel free to unmute as you feel you need to. All right. So what does reconciliation have to do with healing? So according to the TRC, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, reconciliation is the process of establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. So you'll notice that I may use the word Aboriginal or Indigenous or Native interchangeably, okay? So whether you are Indigenous or non-Indigenous, whether you're a government official or a helper or a common community member, reconciliation concerns you. In order for reconciliation to occur, there has to be an awareness of the past, an acknowledgement of the harm that's been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. So the harm referenced here is deeply rooted in Canada's colonial legacy. This is where story is important. We must listen and acknowledge the stories of past and ongoing harm, and then we must take our opportunity to be part of a new story, a brighter Canada for everyone. land. We all have a role in that story. Now, the vehicle that moves us from passive bystander to active listener to storyteller and participant is healing. Healing is an action, and it shares the quality of constant motion with all things that have spirit. So from an Indigenous worldview, everything is animate and has spirit. So like healing, stories, relationships, and the land, they are all evolving, ever changing. And so you must take the time to listen and to acknowledge the stories that are apparent in all of those things, in that movement, in that motion. So as I mentioned today, we will talk about our relationships to this place, space, and each other in a spirit of reconciliation, and the stories that braid us and these concepts together. So if you notice in the back of my slide here, you're looking at sweetgrass, braided sweetgrass. So for many Indigenous people here, especially in Treaty 1 and in the Manitoba and Western provinces, sweetgrass is a common medicine that nurtures us physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. This is one of our sacred medicines. Like I said, it's called sweetgrass, and it's commonly braided. So you'd have to note that, you know, depending on where you are, so for example, the West Coast, like out the Salish folks over on the West, they don't have the same medicines as us. So for us here, you know, we offer tobacco, for example. There's some nations on the West Coast that wouldn't do that because they don't have the same plants and medicines that grow there. So when we talk about how important the land is, this is just one of those examples. The medicines that we have is, you know, part of where we come from and the land that we're on. So there's teachings in everything that we do that are honored, preserved, and shared through story. So imagine picking a strand of long grass, sweetgrass. It's a very long, you probably would recognize it if you saw it. It's very long and kind of bushy at the end. So imagine picking a strand of grass. How difficult would it be to break that strand of grass? Probably not that difficult. I know when I go on walks with my kids, they're picking up handfuls of grass and throwing it and breaking it and all that kind of stuff. Now imagine picking 7 strands of long grass and putting them together. It's a little more difficult to break. Now imagine taking 7 strands of grass 3 times and then braiding it and then trying to break it, right? So you can see that there's strength in that unity and in honoring our interconnectedness. This is why I say today we'll share stories about our relationships to this place, space, and each other in a spirit of reconciliation, and those stories that braid us and these concepts together. And when we start to talk about those stories and we start to talk about the ways that we are connected, that's what will make us stronger. That is what will bring healing and change. All right, so I'm going to ask that you get a pen and paper, or you open up a window on your computer, or maybe you use your notepad in your phone, something to jot down a few things. And I'm going to ask you to do this a few different times throughout, and you don't have to share if you don't want to, but I'm just hoping to give you some prompts and ideas for you to think about beyond this discussion, so you can start thinking about your own story. So I'm going to so you're going to write your own story. So for relationships to work, we need to get to know each other so we can try and understand perspectives and ways of being. So let me just take a look here. Maybe I won't be able to see it. All right. So first, I'm not going to be able to see the chat very easily, or your hands up, but maybe just for your own sakes. So I'm going to ask you, who was born in Treaty 1 territory? So if that was you, you can raise your emoji hand there on the chat and just look around your group and see how many hands are going up. Now, if you weren't born in Treaty 1 and maybe you were born in a different numbered treaty, which are one of the 1 to 11 treaties, you can, put up your hand as well that you're in a different treaty, or maybe you don't know what a treaty is, and that's okay too. But to think on where was I born and where do I live, right? Where are we coming from? You had asked that question before we got started. Where are people from? Now, The next question, you can put your hand down if you have it up. Your next question is hands up if you are a gardener, if you like to garden, regardless of where you're from. Put up your hand if you like to garden. And I can't see, so this is for your own benefit. So take a look around the room and see who are your fellow gardeners. And then you can put your hand down. And then the next question I'll ask, and maybe you can put this in the chat, but what does self-care look like for you? So some examples, maybe you spend time outside, maybe you like bubble baths, maybe you prayer or yoga or gathering with your friends and family, whatever self-care looks like to you. Take a minute, maybe you can throw a word into the chat. Let's see if I can view it. Oh, there we go. 4 gardeners here. Oh, awesome. Meditation. Awesome. Yes. Right on. Hiking. Yes, for sure. Walking. Yes, absolutely. Great. Okay, so your next question, last question. Where do you go for healing? Is that a church? Is that in nature? Is that cuddling with your pets? You know, where do you go for that healing? And maybe you can put that in the chat. Nature, walks. Yes, yes, for sure. Yeah. Right on. Okay, so why am I asking where you're from and what you like to do? It's because, you know, when you think about, I like to go to nature to clear my mind. That's something I like to do. I like to just go on a hike. Or, you know, healing for me sometimes is disconnecting from work and going somewhere with my kids that isn't at home so that I don't have to look at the mess in my house. You know, I need to get outside and go and do that. And so for us, we're really lucky because we are really close to Birds Hill Park. So we like to go to Birds Hill Park and we like to walk the Cedar Bog Trail because there's big cedar trees there, and we like to harvest cedar. And we can do that any time of year. Cedar is a medicine that you can harvest any time of year. So that's something that we can do, that I like to do with my kids. And it makes me reflect on, you know, whose land, whose territory am I on, that I have this opportunity to spend that quality time with my kids outside. That healing comes from this land, or this space, or this place that I gather on this land. You know, and it really, you start to think about, oh, I am, you know, these different ways that you're connected to spaces and places. You know, when I ask this question, lots of people in other discussions have talked about, we have a family cabin. We have a family cabin at whatever lake it is. And you ask, oh, what treaty territory is your family cabin on? Not many people know. Not many people know. We know if you're on Treaty 1 because we hear the land acknowledgement all the time. But where's your family cabin? You know, because that is the traditional land of somebody. And somebody has been the caretaker of that land prior to our families settling here. For many of us that are settlers here. So starting to get that brain thinking about the places that are important to us and how we're connecting. So I'm going to share more about my personal story, and there's not a quiz on this at all. I'm going to share lots of personal stories next. And my reason for doing that is, first of all, it's the end of the winter season. And for there are some Indigenous teachings that talk about how important storytelling is. And we actually have a season of storytelling, and it's winter. It's when it's cold outside and warm inside and our families gather. That's a season of sharing stories. And so there's certain times of years that you share stories, and then there's other types of times of year where you're out on the land, right? So we're coming to an end of the season of storytelling, but I figure we'll squeeze it in here because it's fitting. Storytelling is important because it's healing. It's healing for the storyteller, but it also can be healing for the people receiving that story. And so in my sharing, I'm going to thank you in advance, because this is always a healing opportunity for me to share various stories about my life, and about the way that I connect to the land. And I'm hoping that it's going to give you ideas on maybe how you connect to the land. So you can forget all of my stories as soon as I'm done talking. And I hope you replace those stories with your own stories. All right, so here we go. This is my story in a slide of pictures. In the background, there's an art piece called Wisdom of the Universe. It's by a Métis artist named Christy Belcourt. She has that traditional Métis style of art, the florals. It's beautiful. I love that she does lots of art about wisdom and knowledge and those kinds of things, and that always resonates with me. So that's why I chose that for the background. And there's a whole bunch of pictures here, so I'll get around to explaining why those are all here. Okay, so I am Métis with ancestral ties to the original heart and homeland of the Red River Métis Nation here in Manitoba in Treaty 1. I've been fortunate to be gifted grandparents who inspired me to embrace Métis culture and identity. And I've also witnessed and felt the impacts of how colonialism has affected generations in my family and people that I love. So here in the middle is a picture of me and my two boys, Reed and Branson, and two dogs that we have. So just some of the many pets that we have out here where we live. We live on a small acreage near the Stone Fort, which is Lower Fort Garry, here in Treaty 1. And this is significant because the Stone Fort is where Treaty 1 was actually signed in August of 1871. So when you're acknowledging Treaty 1, you are acknowledging an agreement that was made between the Crown and the Indigenous nations of this territory that was signed, you know, a walk away from my house. I pass it all the time, and I'm filled with gratitude for that relationship and a commitment, that constant renewal of that commitment to doing the work, that heart work. So we love the land here. We garden, although last year was mostly weeds, but we try to garden. We have chickens. So you'll see a picture up there at the top right. That's me with one of my chickens that I hatched. Her name was Marshmallow, and she's a silky hen. In our yard, we have a very big yard. We have tree forts. We have paths that kind of zigzag all through our yard. We live close to a train track, and at the back of the track, there's a trail that goes all for a very long time, and sage grows wild there. And so my kids know what it is, and they'll pick the sage right from our yard. Our yard, we also currently we have a backyard skating rink, although it's covered in about 2 feet of snow. And so, yeah, we pick medicines that are nearby. I was talking about sweetgrass earlier. And this is really sacred to Indigenous peoples here. And I'm really fortunate that my kids have those lessons and have those teachings so that they know, and they're interested in learning more. And they can do that right here where they live, which is really special because not all Indigenous people have access to their homeland, to their territory, or to their medicines, or to their culture, especially when they're in an urban setting. Another thing is, like I mentioned, we like to harvest cedar. We're really close to Bird Hill Park, but we also have some cedar around here. I also have a medicine garden in my yard where I grow and I harvest tobacco, for example. I was gifted seedlings, which I went to seed, and it was a total fluke because I'm actually not a very good gardener at all, but it was obviously meant to be. And I was able to share my seeds and seedlings with a whole bunch of people at Gani Ganichak, which is an organization that I do some work with as well. So many of our physical, when I say many, I'm talking about my family that lives here. Many of our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual needs are met on this land that we get to take care of, and that takes care of us. So I bought this house on my own after some difficult times in my life. I was on my own with my kids, and I, for some reason, had this urge to leave the city and to buy an acreage, which I'm sure my family thought that I was crazy for doing that. At that time in my life, I felt really hopeless. I was experiencing lots of grief. I was lost. I lacked a sense of self. I had a lot of healing to do. So something drew me to moving to this house. I saw this house actually for months before I actually was able to purchase it. Now, there's a teaching that I'm not going to, I don't have permission to share the teaching, but I'll share the gist of the teaching about babies and their umbilical cords. So there's a teaching that when a baby's umbilical cord falls off, the parents take that and they take it to ceremony on the land. And there's a ceremony that you do on that land, and you do that where the child is from. So you do that in your community. And the idea is that the child will always be grounded there. So interestingly, after I moved here, when I was nearly 30 years old, not a child at all, 30 years old, I was exploring my new neighborhood, and I was going west down my gravel road. And at the end of the road, I saw the house that my grandma lived in, and that I lived in with my mom when I was first born. And I had no idea that I was moving just down the road to the very house that I lived in when I was first born. And that I grew up visiting, we called it the farm. And I remember being a kid, and it was so big, and we had so much space. And now I drive by it, and it's actually like a 600 square foot home. There was like 8 of us living there. And it's tiny, but nonetheless, I remember it being so big and there being a forest. And it's funny because the forest is actually just the bush line that separates the property from the highway. But, I didn't notice that I had moved so close to it because I hadn't been to the farm for many years, like since I was, a young adolescent. I never went down that highway after my grandma passed away, and I had lost connection to that land. I lost connection to that place and those stories. And so when I told my mom about this teaching about the umbilical cord, I said, "Mom, what did you do with my umbilical cord?" And she's like, that was like 35 years ago. I have no idea what you're even talking about. But we figured that she threw it away, but it was thrown away there. And, so like the teaching goes, the child will always feel grounded and belong there. So in a time of disconnection and feeling lost and reflecting on that teaching, I instantly felt like I belonged where I was again. So it's funny how the land can connect you to those memories and create feelings of belonging and a sense of self. That is healing. So now on my grandpa's side, our ancestors are from East Selkirk area, which is actually the settlement, the Métis settlement is called St. Andrews, and it's in Treaty 1. And it's right on the other side of the river from where I live. So his grandparents enfranchised 3 months before his mother was born, and they assimilated to the city. So enfranchisement is a process that status Indians, that Canada required status Indians to do. They gave up their status in order to become Canadian citizens up until the 60s. And there were a whole number of reasons why you would be enfranchised, whether you wanted to or not. So for example, if you wanted to pursue university, you had to be enfranchised. If you wanted to vote, you had to be enfranchised. If you, as a woman, if you married or had a child with a non-status Indian, you had to be franchised. If you left the community, you had to be enfranchised. If you served in the war, you were enfranchised. If you wanted legal representation, you were enfranchised. So many, many different things, many different really oppressive policies, Canadian policy existed over time. So in my own family, like I said, my grandpa's grandparents enfranchised 3 months before his mother was born, and then they assimilated to the city. So at that time, it was mandatory for children to attend residential schools. So I can imagine how difficult it would have been for them at that point in their life, knowing they were expecting a child in 3 months' time. And if they were to maintain their status and stay in their community, their child would very likely be, would be required to attend residential school. And so they made the choice to enfranchise and leave their community, to give up that connection to their community. My grandpa's uncles, his father, and other male relatives that would have taught him his roles and responsibility as an Indigenous man in their community were also enfranchised around that time due to serving in the wars, the early wars. So because of this disconnection from his community, my grandpa wasn't connected with his Indigenous identity. And it has been a long process of reclamation through uncovering stories about how we're connected to each other and to the land. So, for example, I didn't know the story of my grandpa's grandparents enfranchising and assimilating. We could never understand why they were disconnected, but my grandpa's uncles were members of Peguis First Nation. We could never figure out why they were first cousins and so different. And before my grandpa passed away 2 years ago, he was eligible to reclaim his Indian status through Indian Affairs because his mother was enfranchised and there was changes to the Indian Act and whatnot. So he was started that process, and he passed away before he ever got the response. So he was never acknowledged or never received his status. So he was always by default Métis. And also, you know, the St. Andrew settlement was a very early Métis settlement. So he was always a citizen of the Métis Nation, but did not reclaim his status. And it wasn't until we went to appeal it and Indian Affairs sent us back documents of the enfranchisement of his family. So then, of course, I'm looking through the documents and I'm looking through the genealogy and I'm looking at church records and cemetery records and doing all this research, uncovering these stories, right? And that's how important story is, because it really provides that healing to families, even when it's a generation or 2 or 3 generations later. Now, my grandma's family has ties to Fairford, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 2 territory. Now, I remember one time traveling to Steep Rock, Manitoba, which is known for their beautiful water, and there's some camping, and they used to have goats there, I think, on an island. So I remember going there as a kid with my grandma because her mom was from there and lived there and visited and spent time there. So we went to Steep Rock to go visit the cabin that they would go to. And they were from Fairford. So today I do work at Treaty 2 for the First Nations of Treaty 2 government. So you'll see on the top left-hand side over here, this bunch of circles. This is actually a peacemaking framework, a governance model it's a traditional governance model based on the Anishinaabe clan system. So I do work for them there now in Treaty 2, and I had no idea that I was connected to Treaty 2 until one day when I was working and meeting all these people from the community. I realized, hey, I was talking to people from Fairford, and they go, yeah, Fairford's in our territory, and there's a Penay First Nation, and yada, yada, yada. And wow, I'm doing work for the government of Treaty 2 that my family has ties to, right? So it was really neat then talking to my grandma afterwards and telling her all about the work and all the things that were happening in these communities that she remembers when she was young. So, and on the way home one day from Penay First Nation, I was driving back and I saw the sign that said Steep Rock, whatever distance away. So I took a sudden turn, went down a gravel road, and went to Steep Rock to go to the water, make an offering at that water, and look around. And it brought me back to those memories of being there as a child with my grandma, reminiscing about her mom and her childhood in that place on that land, and how sacred that was for them. And now for me, being able to give back into that community. Above me, above this picture here, there's a picture of me and the boys again. And we're on some ceremony land that's in Treaty 1, out in East Selkirk area as well. So we're very fortunate because we were welcomed to this sacred land where we can connect with, people and culture, and we can go and pray. And the elder who takes care of that piece of land is Myra Laramie, there's a photo of her down here in this Zoom screen call, because she was actually an advising elder on my graduate studies my thesis committees. So I met her actually through school, and she has now adopted myself and my kids and to her family, to her land. And we've been able to go there, and my kids have been able to be part of building a sweat lodge. And the three of us were part of building a women's lodge and getting teachings. And it was, we're very fortunate to be welcomed there. And it's important because this is a place now that my kids have been exposed to those sacred teachings and to those people. And when you think about what's our biggest reach for making change, meaningful change in Canada, or for reconciliation, it actually starts with us. And it starts in your own circle of influence, right? And our biggest circle of influence starts with our family. So especially for those of us with young kids that haven't yet hardened to the world, they are so impressionable. And so it's about taking those opportunities to connect those young people to the land and to the teachings. And that action in itself is an act of reconciliation. Whether you're Indigenous or not Indigenous, reconciliation is going to mean something different to you, but the act of participating and connecting with the land is an act of reconciliation. So as I mentioned down here, this is a photo of some of my mentors and teachers who are part of my academic journey here on Treaty 1. And this is important because it's because of my academic studies that I've been able to move forward in my career in a lot of ways. So I've gained something from those educational opportunities that I was able to do in Treaty 1, and that that the research that I did with Indigenous people and in Indigenous communities, being very aware of the people and the traditional lands that they belong to, right? And because of that, because of their wisdom and their generosity, myself and my family benefits from that, right? And then there's a picture of, this is a few years old now, but this is myself and Michael Champagne. We're at Meet Me at the Bell Tower. When it was there, we were talking about justice, which is something I'm really passionate about, but it makes me reflect on the experience of urban Indigenous people in particular. So when we talk about Treaty 1, yes, this is a sacred place, but it's a challenge for a lot of urban Indigenous people because there's not a lot of connections for culture and identity here in an urban space, right? So there's a lot of unique challenges to that. And then it makes me reflect up here on Gani Ganichak, which is the organization that I do a lot of work with now, whose one of their goals is to provide that culture and community to urban Indigenous people. So when you are urbanized and you're here in this in Treaty 1, but maybe you're from another treaty or your homeland is somewhere else, those connections, and I think of how I shared that story of realizing how close I really was to the family connections, my ancestral ties, and now I've ended up here, it really reaffirms my sense of belonging and my sense of identity, right? It's difficult for people that are not in the place that they belong. And so we have community-based work that's aware of this, that seeks to bring culture to these urban spaces and provide opportunities for urban Indigenous people to connect with the land. Now, lastly, this picture over here in the back of my car, the boys and I, we love road trips. We have family in Treaty 2 north of Dauphin. We like to drive, even though it's a 5-hour drive, it's very long with 2 young kids. But we're grateful to be on that open highway and have access to travel in the way that we do. So many Indigenous people today can no longer, struggle to have access to travel, right? So thinking about those urban folks or people in remote communities, getting in your vehicle and going down the highway to visit your family in another treaty territory or just even down the road is a challenge for people. And it's those connections with family that that's very healing for us, right? So we know how important that relationships and those connections are, and travel is very important for that purpose. It also makes me reflect on the fact that there was a time in Canada where Indigenous people were not allowed to leave their First Nations communities. The pass system, right? That was up until the mid 1950s, right? Like, so you couldn't leave your community without having permission signed by an Indian agent. And here we are, Indigenous folks today can get in our vehicle and travel freely throughout the province. It makes me feel very fortunate and grateful for that ability, right? To have that access. So these are some stories about all the different ways I'm connected to different people and places and spaces. I hope it's giving you some ideas about maybe how you're connecting with some of the important space in your life. All right, so this is a picture of two turtles. The artist of this painting or this picture is Jackie Travers. I chose this painting because the turtle represents the teaching of truth. And Indigenous peoples across North America have always referred to North America as Turtle Island since time immemorial. Since before Canada, it was Turtle Island. So you'll hear people refer to North America as Turtle Island. Canada became Canada when we decided to put lines across the back of the turtle. And if you look at a map, the shape of North America, it resembles the turtle. Our stories about this land are about how we live here, how we thrive here, how we are cared for here, and how we help others here. There's many, many beautiful stories about the way that we connect, right? So take a moment and reflect on your own stories and jot down a few words that come to mind for you about your relationship to the land. So I want you to think about, how do you connect to the land that you are on today, or maybe that you belong to, that you are longing for? How do you connect physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually? And if you feel inclined to share, you can share some thoughts or words or comments in the chat. Any takers? If not, that's okay. Write it, jot it down as a prompt and come back to it. To learn its history. Yes. Awesome. Good. That's a good actionable item. Like, that's a goal, right? That's something that you can actually accomplish, to commit to learning about the history, or commit to learn about the land that you're on. To Kenneth is saying to look at issues in the land that may need to be resolved. Yes. So are there any unresolved, especially in the context of treaties? What are the unresolved treaty issues in the territory that you live in? There's lots of them. We should know about them, because we are all treaty people if we are living on treaty land. All right. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'm going to ask you to reflect again. So this painting is called Scream by Kent Monkman. It was part of an exhibition at the Winnipeg Art Gallery recently. And this is representative of somebody's story, somebody's lived experience on land here in Canada. Very different than some of the stories that I've shared about my experiences with my family. But when I think of my own family as well, and I think about why my grandfather's family enfranchised, I think of, this is the image that they were seeing at that time, that they wanted to protect themselves and their children from. So healing requires acknowledging the truths and stories, even if they're uncomfortable or if they don't align with your own experience. That's okay. We all have different stories. We could all be from the same place and have different stories about that land. So the difference is okay. The discomfort is okay. It should be uncomfortable. When you look at this picture, again, reflecting, thinking of some words that come to mind for you. What's coming up for you? What are your thoughts? What are your feelings when you see this? Can you relate? Or is this something that goes, this is not representative of the story that I have of this land? Either way, that's okay. We need to be equally as open and accepting of the fact that not all stories about this place and space and these treaty territories that we live in are beautiful for everyone. This is a, sorry, so yes, the stories like this, the tragedy, the hurtful, the painful stories, the uncomfortable stories, they exist, they are alive, they continue to exist, they continue to be alive for lots of people. And you know, if your story doesn't align with this, and this is very uncomfortable for you, you know, it's not that this should erase or change your ideas or your stories, right? It's not going to change your lived experience, but learning about these other stories may shape how you live out your own story going forward. Being aware of the other stories of the land may shape the way you move forward in your own story. All right, so I'm going to share a few quotes by Dr. Thomas King, who's an Indigenous scholar, author, and storyteller. He says, "The truth about stories is that's all we are." So just taking a moment on that. The truth about stories is that's all we are. He teaches us that not only do we have stories that we like to tell about ourselves, like I just shared a whole bunch of them, we also have stories about other people. And sadly, for Indigenous peoples, the dominant North American discourse has been overly negative and harmful for Indigenous people. I'm going to do a reading from a book called Impact, Colonialism in Canada. And I'm just going to read from the foreword here by Megan James Sinclair. The entrance of story into the world is like new life. You first have to get to know it, and much help is needed. If you're lucky enough to have a story enter your life, you know what I mean. The story needs some guidance in her first steps, but soon enough, she is walking on her own, influencing, shaping, and growing completely by herself. This is a beautiful process to be part of, but also a scary one as your story at some point becomes completely its own. After all, we don't own stories, we own our relationship to them. And another quote by Dr. King, "If we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives." So I'm going to give you some prompts again to start reflecting on your story that you tell about yourself. The story we hear, stories we tell. All right, so you don't have to respond to this per se, but these are just some ideas, okay? So in an autobiography of your life so far, what lessons would a reader or receiver of that story learn? So if someone was reading the story of your life, what lessons would they take away? Now imagine that a coworker or a peer or a student writes a story about you. What lessons would a receiver of that story learn? So that is someone else's perception of you. What is someone going to learn from that? Are they the same or are they different? More than likely, the way that we tell our stories about ourselves is going to differ from a story that someone else is going to tell about us, because they simply don't know all of the things that there is to know to tell a story. And this is in essence what happens for Indigenous people here. We have the Canadian version of a story of Indigenous people. And for far too long, it's been overly negative and harmful for Indigenous people. This is why it's so important to hear Indigenous peoples tell their own story, to tell stories about how they're connected to the land, tell stories about their ancestral ties to the land, how they heal from the land. So what stories shape or inform or inspire you to live the life that you live today? So thinking about what are the stories of inspiration? So for me, you know, I'm inspired by the power and the resilience of Indigenous people, particularly of Indigenous women. The resilience, the stories that I hear are just so empowering, so inspiring, makes me want to be a better person, makes me reaffirm that commitment to reconciliation, which requires healing that starts with me, and then my family, then my community, right? So thinking about what stories shape your life. What are some stories you hope to be told about you? And what stories do you want to be part of tomorrow? All right, so when we talk about stories, we talk about language, and this language, there's so much to be said about language, but what I want to share with you in terms of language is this. So when you live your life in a good way, which is a balanced way in a spirit of reconciliation, you contribute to collective healing, and in turn, you receive healing. That relationship between giving and receiving healing is reciprocal in nature. And in fact, it's interconnected. So for instance, that saying, hurt people hurt people. Healed people can heal people, right? You must first reconcile in yourself. And this means live in balance and harmony within yourself and in your community and with this land and the original caretakers of this land who have made it possible for us to live and thrive here. When it comes to telling and living out our stories, language is important. So here are a few concepts I want to share so that you can think critically about all the relationships you have that we've talked about so far. So first, reconciliation. So we've already gone over what the definition of that, but let's get right into reflecting. So I want you to think, and you can share if you want in the chat, how many people can recall one call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And if you can recall one, can you recall 5? Do you know how many there are? There's 94. Do you know when it was released? 2015. Do you know how many have been implemented? Less than 15. What are the ways, your next question to reflect on in terms of reconciliation is, what are the ways that you can relate to colonialism? Maybe you are, you know, being harmed by colonial. I mean, we're all being harmed by colonialism, but thinking about the way that you relate to colonialism. How about something a little more uncomfortable? How do you benefit from colonialism? How do we benefit from colonial structures? So if you don't know or aren't aware, reflect on why that is. How have we been able to live our life without having to reflect on a relationship and the way that we are impacted by colonialism? This means we acknowledge the privilege that some have in never having to face their uncomfortable relationship to colonialism, while others are suffering at the hands of it. So our next concept, land acknowledgement. Oh, we could do a whole nother one of these, and we have on land acknowledgements. This is something that settlers or visitors say to acknowledge where they are dwelling at that time, or where you're talking from. For Indigenous people, you don't have to, you are welcoming, right? Indigenous people welcome you to the land. Settler people do an acknowledgement of the land that they're on as a visitor. So a land acknowledgement should acknowledge truth. So who are the original caretakers of that territory, for example? It should acknowledge the ways in which the individual or the organization relates to historical and ongoing colonialism. Reflect back to what we just talked about in reconciliation. And then your land acknowledgement should contain a commitment to action, right? So we think back, what was the definition of a reconciliation? To know the truth and for there to be action. There is no reconciliation without action. A land acknowledgement is a passive land acknowledgement until there is a commitment to action. We can't, we can acknowledge the harms that take place on the territory that we're from. We can appreciate the land, but what does that do for our relationship to the land and to those people, to the people whose territory it is, if we're not making a commitment to action? The next concept, allyship. This goes beyond common decency, right? So when people, I'm an ally, I have really good intentions, I'm an ally. That's good intentions is that's common decency, right? Allyship goes a step farther than that. It requires you to actively denounce and dismantle the injustice. It's not enough to just care. There has to be action. So where do you stand, and where can you utilize your circle of influence or your ability to act, or the resources that you have access to? Your next one, indigenize. Indigenize, this is where we add elements of culture. So we make tweaks so that things fit better for Indigenous people. It doesn't require systemic or structural change. So we hear lots of, at post-secondary institutions, for example, we're going to indigenize the institution. That means structurally we're staying the same, but we may bring in some Indigenous representation. We'll have more Indigenous students. We'll get some more Indigenous teachers. We'll put some art up. We'll talk about things differently, but structurally things are the same. It's not to say that this is good or bad, but it's to make sure that we're understanding these concepts. And so that's indigenizing. Decolonizing. This is, we often hear, I'll give an example. There's an organization, a government organization that has a reconciliation plan. And in their plan, they say, we are committed to decolonizing. We are taking a decolonized approach to our efforts that we're doing in the government. To decolonize means to dismantle colonialism. Something that a colonial system, in fact, is not doing. Unless you are actively dismantling that system, you're not decolonizing. So then what the feedback to that would be is what you're actually doing is indigenizing, which is okay. That's okay. It's not good or bad. We're not saying anything's good or bad. That's what works for you. You're indigenizing, but we're not decolonizing. So it depends. Language is important because it's connected to action, right? All right. So in conclusion, Native philosopher Dr. Leroy Littlebear reminds us about the central tenets of Native ways of knowing, one of which is that all things are imbued with spirit. All things have a spirit. The water, the rocks, the trees, the animals, people, we all have spirit. And because of that, we're all related. On the same, like we were talking early, stories have a spirit. Stories are alive. They're always moving. That's why we relate to stories. That's why we have a relationship to knowledge, right? Because, for example, if you learn something new, tomorrow you could wake up and never think about that thing again. And that's the end of the relationship with that knowledge. Or you could learn something new, and then you can actively nurture your relationship with that knowledge. You could commit to learn more. You could commit to share it with your circle of influence. You could commit to reflect. You can commit to grow that knowledge in yourself. That's your relationship with that knowledge. And last, how will you honor your relationship with the stories of the land? So again, more prompts for you to think about after we finish. How will you honor your relationship with the stories of the land? With the lessons that you've learned from the land, that you can learn from the land. So you may choose to tend to this relationship, or you may choose to continue to conceptualize and share your story both in word and in action. And you can start today by reflecting and acting on the things that you've written down so far. And lastly, I shared this before and I'll share it again. I'm still not a poet, but this is something that I wrote after I reflected on making a different variation of this presentation. O Canada, our home on native land, ancestral ties root me here. This land I inherently care for and receive everything I need. This land on which we've suffered yet heal. This land where I practice and serve the people whom I share ancestral ties and visitors who share this home on native land. Marcy, thank you. That concludes my conversation.
And thank you so much, Jen. Marichelle, do we have any questions from the chat?
They're actually more of sharing, like one mentioned storytelling can be a good medicine. And then Jen, who's saying that she has students, right, from the MacLeod Adult Education Center, is that their semester theme in grade 12 English is truth and justice. And we have been discussing how history is never just one truth. So hello to the students, we see you.
Well, Jen, thank you so much. This evening has been very thought-provoking for me. I know I started my journey on truth and reconciliation last year, as I think many of us did. And I felt that there was almost a pause, and now it's starting again for us to consider, what is our relationship with the land, with our Indigenous predecessors, and how and what do we need to do to play a role in reconciliation. And I think you very much gave us some tools and some information that's going to help us to move along in that reconciliation process. So thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your story. And I hope that everyone who's attended tonight will think about their stories and how they fit together as we live on this land that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have shared with us. So thank you. If anyone wants to share any final words, love to hear from you.
I just have a question.
Oh,
How
certainly.
do we get the recording? You mentioned it, because I'd like to go over again some of the questions and how do we do that?
Yes, there's a little technical difficulty. So the beginning intro is not there, but Georgine is going to put it together and she'll provide the link. So Jen's presentation is definitely in there. So once it's been downloaded from the cloud and cleaned up, it will be shared with you.
Okay, thank you. So it'll come through email, is that it?
I believe that's how you'll get the link.
All right, thank you.
All right, well, thank you.